Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. Today is an experiment because I'm actually recording this podcast live. Some of you know that I actually record a video version as well as an audio version of the podcast, and the software I use to do that is called StreamYard. It's the same software that I use for live YouTube interviews with other people, and they have a feature that says rather than streaming it to the internet, you can simply record it and then download the recording. And even if you stream it, you can still download the recording. But what I discovered was if you just record and don't stream, the video quality is often poor. Those of you who've been watching me on the videos, you probably see pixelations as if the network is bad or something like that. And so I'm doing an experiment to just live stream this baby and see how the video quality does. And of course, that gives me no opportunity to easily fix something that I botch. I often do restart because I often stumble out of the gate when I'm not really sure exactly what I want to say. But this time, we're just going to go for it. So I hope it works out, and maybe I'll be doing this regularly from now on. I do have a podcast topic for today. But what I want to do is start off by talking a little bit about the impact that we are having here. And I'm going to talk about religious impact in a bit, but I first want to start talking about political impact based on some of my existing work around public policy, state and local governments, etc. You may recall that back in November, I put out an article in American Affairs Journal called Indiana Under Republican Rule. And it was about a 7,000-word retrospective on the last 16 years in the state of Indiana, in which the Republicans have basically run the state. They've had the governorship since 2005, and they've controlled the state legislature as well since 2011. And I just go through and show everything that they did, and then show the results. And I said, we just have to face the facts. The results were not good. The state has demographically and economically lagged. Population growth slow, job growth slow. The state has gotten poorer relative to the nation. It's created essentially a bare bones economy. It's got bottom of the barrel educational attainment. I went through all the stats and said, this isn't good. That article has triggered an important and high impact series of events in the state. So first, my article itself just blew up. And that's not me saying that. A guy who runs a little political newsletter here called Importantville, Adam Wren. People often confuse us. There's Aaron Wren and Adam Wren. His is spelled W-R-E-N. He's the one that said that. In fact, the governor was actually forced to respond to this in the newsletter. Obviously, he took issue with it. But it's not just that the newsletter itself went big. A lot of other things happened. So Mike Hicks, who's probably the leading economist in the state. He's at Ball State University. He focuses a lot on kind of the state's communities, and he writes a column in newspapers in the state that's syndicated. He's been on a tear, just saying, look, basically Aaron is understating it. The problems are actually worse than he says. In fact, some of the stats that he's come up with are ones I could have put in the article. I wish I could have put them in the article. For example, the last decade in Indiana was the worst decade ever in educational attainment in terms of how our college degree attainment rate compared to the nation. We fell so far behind the nation in 2010. It's not even funny. And there's just a slew of data. And this sort of was out there. And then, and I can't take credit for this necessarily, Indiana lost a high-profile series of multi-billion-dollar advanced manufacturing location decisions. The most important and the biggest was Intel, which is putting a $20 billion, 3,000 employee chip plant in Columbus, Ohio, right next door. GM's putting $7 billion into electric vehicles in Michigan. Kentucky got a battery plant. Ford put a $10 billion investment into Tennessee. Toyota went down to North Carolina. And even the largest private employer here in Indianapolis, Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company, made some big expansions in North Carolina. So people start going, whoa, what's going on? And of course, I'm pointing this out, and actually I'm shipping it to the local business paper. I'm like, you might want to look at the state here. We're losing all these deals. And this caused a big public conversation. What's going on? with us losing these deals. And in fact, the state hastily completely re-engineered a lot of its economic development process. This legislative session earlier this year, they massively increased the amount of subsidies they can offer to business. You can say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they took action. And then they also got into what they call the mega site business, which a lot of states have acquired these multi-thousand acre parcels that they're getting ready for huge investments like Intel or a battery plant. So the state passed a bunch of legislation to essentially authorize them to start building mega sites, which now they're acquiring like 7,000 acres just north of here. So whether that'll pay dividends, I don't know, but they're like, we got to do something. And then a couple weeks ago, the CEO of Eli Lilly, again, basically the most prominent corporation in the state, gave a speech at the Economic Club of Indiana where he's like, we are falling behind and we've got serious problems in terms of educational levels, in terms of cost of healthcare, other issues. And again, the front page of the Indianapolis Business Journal this week is a big, look at that, saying, what are all the people saying? How are we reacting to what's going on? And so there's been a series of things that have really reshaped the conversation. And prior to my article, a lot of this had actually been known. So I think the people in the know kind of already got a sense that things weren't good. So the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, which is like the big corporate group here, they conducted this series of studies by the Brookings Institution and AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. They hired them to do these studies looking at the Indiana economy. Basically came up and said, it's not good. But of course, Brookings, these people, they write very, very, very boring reports. They're academic sounding reports, and they're very rich and very detailed and very rigorous, but they're not very rhetorically powerful. And groups like CICP can't really attack the state government. Anyway, and, Michael Hicks had also been, writing some of his columns before and wasn't, necessarily resonating. People were like, he's a crackpot. After my article hit, it completely changed the game such that people had to start taking these things seriously. And again, there's some providence to that in terms of, losing these deals, which all of a sudden, even the biggest booster for the state, when Intel picks the state next door and not you, that causes a lot of conversations. So I can't claim 100% credit for it. But now these things are starting to hit and they're starting to land in a way that they didn't prior to my article. And again, one person, one article, you can't take credit for everything. It's sort of like a sales deal in a corporation. Everybody who ever touched that tries to claim 100% credit. I'm not going to claim 100% credit, but it was an important part of that. And I think what we see here too is how this idea of outsider cultural change works. So I mentioned Eric Hoffer and how the elites pick up the ideas often from the outer circle, and that's sort of what happened here. Eli Lilly's CEO, by reiterating some of the points that I made, validated them in a way that my article itself wouldn't have done. So I'm not necessarily a total outsider. I have a lot of networks and connections, and obviously major publications who publish me. So, I'm not like a truly outsider. Again, I'm not going to deny that at some level I am an elite. I'm part of the elite, but I wasn't part of that inner circle here in Indy. I come up with these ideas. Michael Hicks kind of comes up with these ideas. And then when the most powerful CEO in the state says them, that puts the seal of approval on them. And all of a sudden everybody's like, we have to do something. And so I don't know what is going to happen in the state. Clearly, they've taken a different approach on incentives and site assembly. I think now there is actually an understanding, you're not going to hear the governor, admit this publicly, and nor should we expect him to do so. Now there's an understanding among the leadership of the state that the results are really not what they should be, and something needs to be done to that. Now, will they actually do anything? That's an open question. But it shows, I think, that the conversation has been changed, and I'm gratified, to have played a role in that. And that's really one of the things that I have, the gifts I've been given, is the ability to take and synthesize all of this information into a coherent narrative and show powerfully through facts, logic, frameworks, and rhetoric exactly what is going on that maybe people sensed and saw but couldn't quite put their finger on, and inject a new way of thinking into the conversation. And again, I'm not claiming that's some great skill I came up with. It's just one of the natural gifts that I've had. And so that happened here in Indiana. And it's the same thing with the three worlds of evangelicalism piece. That negative, positive, neutral world framework has really resonated with a lot of people, not because it's, some scientific finding they had never heard before, but it helps them understand and make sense of impressions that they had. I'm able to take what's going on in the world and turn it into real insights that help people understand and make decisions to start adapting in a practical way. And so I'm very gratified for that. So similar thing has happened with the negative world framework, which is really resonating with people out there. And over the course of my writings in sort of the Christian space and the men's space, I'll get these emails from people, and they'll tell me about things that they're doing in response to what I've been writing. So I used to write more sort of men's self-improvement stuff, and I would get emails from people like, hey, you changed my life. Like, I got this newsletter from you, and I stopped doing X, Y, and Z, and I started doing A, B, and C, and now things are going different. I'm like, oh my goodness, like that's pretty amazing. Or I'll get sent an audio or a video clip. Here's a pastor in the pulpit quoting from your newsletter. I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And just this week, the reason I even brought this topic up, just in the last week, I got a couple of really interesting emails. One was from a guy in London, and he said, Aaron, I listened to your podcast on how to build local community. And this Sunday night dinner concept that you outlined that was being done in Indianapolis sounded very interesting. So I decided to start one of those in London. So I got a bunch of people together, and we had one, and we actually discussed your article about the positive, neutral, negative world. I'm like, that's amazing. And if you're listening, thank you so much for sending that. I put all this stuff out here. I broadcast it out, and sometimes I don't know how it's affecting people. And so I really appreciate it when people take the time to write and to say how they're responding to this. It's really gratifying, particularly when it's positive. It's negative, it's sometimes not so pleasant, but often still very valuable. So you can send that too. So it's great to see somebody taking practical, tangible, concrete steps to create local community as a result of what and I think this is a collective project. This isn't just about me. This is about us. This is a community, and you all are a big part of making this happen. People are actually making tangible improvements in the world at small scale, and hopefully over time building to bigger and bigger scales, because we need to be thinking big, not just small scales, as I've been writing. Another thing that I was told was that someone had heard a talk that I gave about own space and the importance of the cultural center, and decided to open a co-working space on the main street of their town. So somebody sent me an announcement about the opening of this co-working space and says, Aaron, this is what people are doing in response to what you're writing. I'm kind of blown away by it. So it's very important to understand that this really is making an impact out there on people and on the world. And that's gratifying, but it's also humbling, because every time I hear that someone is taking action in the real world in response to what I am saying, either as an individual or as an institution, I'm like, oh my goodness, there is an incredible weight of responsibility that comes with that. When I'm just a regular Twitter account, throwing banter out there, giving my opinion, it's one thing. And it's always good to kind of be involved in the fray and in the banter. But when you start seeing people changing the way that they're living their lives, someone taking a huge risk by starting a business, someone, preaching from the pulpit what you're saying, that comes with an incredible level of responsibility. I believe it's James who says, don't let many of you seek to become teachers, because teachers are going to incur a stricter judgment. And he's referring there to, pastors or people who are teaching the Bible, which I am not a Bible teacher. And I always stress that. I am a cultural commentator, not a Bible teacher. But the same thing applies in other domains, I think. If we are setting ourselves up or in a position of leadership, there is going to be a judgment for that. So we need to be very serious about what we're doing, because it affects people's lives. It might even affect the policy of a state government or a federal government. It might affect the way that the church in America is responding to the world. And again, I can't always control what people do with what I say. I might say something great and they'll do something dumb. I might give great advice that people take and it doesn't work out. That's why I'm so hesitant to give direct advice to people in situations, because in the past, I received some advice that was actually quite good advice, and following it turned out disastrously. It wasn't that the advice was bad. It's just that things turned out bad. You start a business like a co-working space, that's an entrepreneurial risk. The guy doing that, he knows what he's doing. He's a big boy. What I have to think about, and all of us have to think about, what is what we're saying affecting what other people are doing, and take it seriously when we give people advice, when we talk about what people ought to be doing. And again, that especially becomes important as we level up. The bigger that you get, the more high profile that you get, the more people who are listening to what you say, the more that you are viewed as an authority, the more that you have to elevate your game. And when we see a lot of these big name politicians or preachers, and we observe how cautious they are in what they say, and how manicured and carefully constructed and stage managed everything they say is, like, man, this seems fake, it seems phony, it seems very marketing driven. And there's some of that that's true. But you also have to keep in mind, those people have a weight of responsibility hanging on their words that other people don't. When a big name guy makes a tweet, there are a million people out there looking to pick them apart. And maybe there's a million other people who are ready to do whatever that guy says. He's like, I have to be really, really, really rigorous about what I'm doing. So that's what I aspire to do here. I aspire to be serious. I aspire to be rigorous. I aspire to be worthy of the trust that people have placed in me. And so I'm going to try to live up to the expectations that are on me for being in this situation. And I also just want to give a huge thank you to all of you, because I would not be in this situation where people are doing these things if not for you, if not for those of you who shared this with your friends, if not for those of you who supported financially what we're doing here. This thing would have been dead a long time ago. I would just be a guy with 200 and something people on the list that wouldn't have gone anywhere. The reason that people listen is because other people, big and small, helped out along the way, whether that be Rod Dreher, who really put this thing on the map, or all of you, all the encouraging notes, sharing it with people is very important. So I do hope you'll become a subscriber on Substack, aaronrun.substack.com. But that's not the main focus here. The point is, we are making an impact in the world. We are not just sitting here in our own little world with things not actually having an impact in the real world. Things that we are doing here are having an impact in the real world, which means we need to all, especially me, take that very, very seriously. So this is basically a podcast in its own right, but I do actually have a topic. Last week, a gentleman by the name of Mark Tooley tweeted some commentary in response to the latest statistics from the Presbyterian Church USA, which is the mainline Presbyterian denomination in the United States. He tweeted, Presbyterian Church USA was over 3 million members 40 years ago and now barely 1 million, falling below the Episcopal Church. Mainline Protestantism's implosion is 60 years old and seemingly irreversible. And by the way, the Episcopal Church is not doing great either. If you look at the Episcopal Church, they are having a going out of business sale. When you look at weddings, when you look at baptisms, when you look at deaths, it's not a good trajectory for them in terms of membership. It's an extremely good financial trajectory for the Episcopal Church and for some of these Presbyterian congregations as well, because as these older people are dying, they're bequeathing their money to the church. Whether that's wise to bequeath money to some of these institutions is a question. But I believe it was Ryan Burge, the guy who wrote The Nuns. I may have got the name wrong. He had this article talking about how the Episcopal Church is actually seeing increases in giving at the same time that it's seeing declines in membership. But it's not just the Episcopal Church. It's not just the Presbyterian Church. It's the mainline Lutherans. It's the American Baptist. It's many of these denominations, Disciples of Christ, etc. They've all been in decline. And I made a quote tweet of this and made a statement that said, look, yes, the main lines have been in decline for 60 years. But guess what? The average evangelical congregation is probably less than 60 years old. When these evangelical churches are as old as these mainline churches, what's going to be happening in the evangelical world? Again, that's sort of a rhetorical point. Again, Twitter is about the banter. Okay, there's genre, right? There's genre podcast. I've said is talk radio. Twitter's for the banter. My kind of newsletter is one level. Big magazine article, like in First Thing, is something else, and then a book is like next level. So you go into like a magazine like American Affairs or First Things. It's I don't just throw out statements unless I've got something to back them up. And so I would just say, honestly, I don't know what the average age of a PCUSA or any kind of mainline congregation is, nor do I necessarily know the average age of an evangelical church. But it seems likely that the median age of an evangelical church is much, much lower than the median age of most of these mainline congregations. Again, not all the mainline congregations are old. There was a vast expansion of the mainline footprint, in the post-war suburbia era. So that 1940 to 1960 era saw a lot of new, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopal type churches established in these growing suburban areas. So there are plenty of Presbyterian churches that aren't that old, but there are a lot of them that are really old. I mean, you go around any small town in Indiana and you see all these church buildings and these congregations that date to like the early to mid 1800s. And in big cities, there are a lot of like really old congregations. And again, you flip over to the evangelical side. Yes, there are plenty of Southern Baptist churches that are probably quite old. There are also some Presbyterian and other type churches that are disaffiliated from these other denominations that are quite old. But by and large, what we think of as a evangelical church, a lot of these suburban megachurches, these Pentecostal churches, most of them just aren't that old. Most of them don't seem to be 60 years old. And so I just pulled here the founding dates of some churches. Willow Creek Church was founded in 1975. Saddleback Church was founded in 1980. Harvest Bible Chapel was founded in 1988. Redeemer Presbyterian, which is an evangelical Presbyterian church, 1989. LifeChurch.tv, which I think is just called Life.Church now, was in 1996. Elevation Church was founded in 2006. I mean, all of these churches are younger than me. And even some of the older ones, yes, there's a technical older age, but they're quite different. I got into a little bit of an interesting debate with a church planter one time. I'm a little skeptical of the church planting movement, as you may know. I think there really is something off about this idea that we have a faith that's based on resurrection, that's based on personal transformation, that's based on, renewing, the city, renewing society, as all these people talk about, right? The gospel, you're not saved by works, as they say, but, the gospel does transform your life. And yet, apparently, the one thing the gospel can't do is renew old, struggling churches. We always have to have new churches because it takes new churches to reach people. There's something a little off about that. I mean, I'm not negative on church planting. I've said, look, there are plenty of examples of these older churches that have been turned around, and I've been part of them, so I start listing them off. So this guy who's a church planter, maybe he's being defensive, appropriately so, because I'm kind of dissing his profession, if you will. He's like, look, those are not churches that were turned around and resurrected. Those are church plants, okay? Those are churches that died and the corpse was taken over by a new congregation. And he didn't phrase it that way, but that's basically what he said. And the truth is, there's probably a lot of truth in that. The church I attended in New York was 200 years old now, 200 years old. But the reality is that church had completely died. It was down to around 30 members or something like that. And by the time I joined it, there were only 2 people from the old congregation there. And in no way, shape, or form did that represent continuity of congregation. It was a complete reboot reset. Again, the church I attended in Chicago was a 150 or so year old German Baptist church. It merged with a multi-site, non-denominational megachurch, I guess you'd say, multi-site church. And it was rebranded, rebooted. So yes, it's there. Yes, the building's there. There's a lot there. But a lot of these congregations essentially were rebooted, if you will, into something different than what they were. And that's not true of all of them. But even if you looked at the older evangelical congregations, probably some of them went through like an inflection point. They brought in a new pastor and he converted it into a megachurch. And now it's still there. But it's almost like a completely different church than it would have been. And so I bring all this up because, I tweet that and I start getting all of these reactions, some of them positive, but some of them are negative. It's like, well, that's not going to happen to us what happened to the Mainline because they abandoned the gospel and we haven't. Or my church is 500 years old. It's an exaggeration, obviously. We're still faithful to the gospel. That's ridiculous. So I just think that there's a sort of smugness or dismissiveness among these evangelical congregations as to the risk that exists for them to go the same way of the Mainline. And that doesn't even have to mean theologically the ways of the Mainline. It could just mean membership-wise, go into a period of decline. When I look at the Mainline churches, I say to myself, wow, look what happened to them. Why is that not going to happen to me? And I think about this a lot in terms of reaching men, for example. Go look at the whole history, going back to even before the muscular Christianity movement, of all these different groups that tried to reach men in the church and they failed. Just ask, why am I going to be any different? Why is what I start going to have any different trajectory than what these other people started? And if we're not thinking about that, then we're not doing our job. And again, things are going to happen in ways we can't predict. It's not always our fault when things go off the rails. I mean, sometimes we're a contributor. Sometimes it is our fault, but sometimes it's not. Nevertheless, there seems to be a complete lack of interest or concern in understanding what happened to the Mainline. If you look at, I guess it's Gresham Macham's book, Christianity and Liberalism, supposedly says, liberal Christianity is a different religion. And this idea that it's a different religion, ergo, we don't have to think about what they're doing or what happened to them because they have no lessons for us, is an idea that really permeates evangelical thinking. The other thing is most evangelicals have essentially zero knowledge of mainline Christianity. You will see tweets or you will see articles written about mainline churches, And in the evangelical world, it tends to be some outre story about someone like Nadia Bowles-Weber or the transgendered Lutheran bishop doing a glitter ceremony, on Ash Wednesday. All the stuff that happens in some of these wacky churches say, look, these people, look at this. We don't have to look at that. And first off, there are close to 9,000 churches in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So this idea that like all churches in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America look like the most crazy churches out there is just not fair, not true. What does the average church look like? What is the experience of some of these places? When I moved to New York City, I was trying to find a church. And so initially I was just visiting churches, trying to decide where I wanted to go. And this sort of morphed into a church exploration project because I realized I'd never been to a Lutheran church. Never been to one. Maybe I ought to go to a Lutheran church and see what they're all about. So that's what I did. I went to a couple Episcopal churches. I went to, a couple of different Lutheran churches. I went to a Lutheran church in the Missouri Synod. I went to one in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I actually went to an Eastern Orthodox service. Said, never been to one. Let's check them out. I went to kind of the liberal Methodist church that had a female pastor. I'm like, what's going on with these places? And what I actually discovered, and I went to many evangelical congregations as well, what I discovered was there was something of value in all of those churches. There was something in those churches that they were getting right that I'm like, there's actually something good here. Even if I don't agree with everything, and even if not everything is healthy in every respect, you can see that there are aspects of it. Some of these Episcopal churches have incredibly beautiful liturgies and music, etc. In fact, one of my observations are the more theologically conservative you are, the worse your liturgy, the worse your aesthetics, the worse. And I'm not saying that aesthetics and liturgy and all this stuff are the measure of faith, but why is it that theological conservatism tends to make you have the schlockiest architecture? There's something wrong, and that's telling us something when we're becoming uglier and less beautiful as we supposedly get closer to God. There's a problem there. There's a problem there. I can't remember the name of this guy. He came up with this 4G models of God. There's like four attributes of God. He's great, he's good, he's glorious, and he's gracious. And my response to that was, well, in the evangelical church, God is very gracious and very good, but he doesn't seem to be all that great, and he's certainly not very glorious. You rarely get any sense of the glory of God in any of these churches. But I just know there's some places that do phenomenally great liturgies. They're very serious about it. Again, I've said, I contrast it to the many Catholic masses I've been to. I don't think I've ever been to a Catholic mass where it didn't feel like the priest was just kind of mailing it in. Some of these Episcopal churches are very serious. The Methodist church that I visited, this female pastor was preaching about love. And one of the quips that she had in her sermon was, I get these complaints from people that I just keep preaching about love all the time. And I'm like, well, I'm going to keep preaching about it because here's why. And it was interesting. And then you saw that there was a family who was leaving this church, which actually had quite a large membership. And there was a big celebration of them and people were honoring them. And you could get a sense from this congregation that they really did have love for each other, that they really were invested in each other's lives. And that this family who was leaving this church, for them to leave really meant the loss of something. Not like perhaps, an all too typical situation in New York where somebody just goes poof and disappears and you never hear from them again. You could see that they had genuine love for one another in this church. I'm not here to defend all these different churches, okay? But there's something good in all of them, and they were not crazy, wacky, insane places on the surface that you would see. And so I think a lot of evangelicals have really never spent 30 seconds trying to learn anything about these mainline churches. Again, it's a very facile, simplistic, they abandoned the gospel, ergo they died, and look at how wacky they are, And wow, that'll never happen to us. That could never happen to us. Again, I think there's something to that. A lot of them did abandon the gospel. Well, why did they do that? And why aren't you going to do that? Because at some point they actually did believe in the gospel. What changed? What happened? Nobody seems very interested in that. And I can also tell you, this would be my practical point for this, that one of the reasons these mainline churches are in decline is because they're very boring. I actually have been sampling a number of services over the internet. The internet makes it a lot easier to check out other churches because I can kind of scan in on their services. And I love to visit churches. I love to check out churches because if you only ever attend one church, I think it's important to have a church home, all of that. But if that's your only experience, then you don't have a perspective on what's going on out there. And because I write about Christianity, I like to have a perspective. One of the things I see is, yeah, there's a reason that these churches are in decline. It's because their services are very boring, that they have set up a style that appeals to the old lady demographic and just not appealing to younger people. It's very boring. And again, there's jokes about this, as well. They, the frozen chosen jokes and all of that. And, they're boring. Well, you know what? A lot of evangelical churches are now getting boring. We like to think of evangelical churches as exciting and it's contemporary music and it's all of this. But the reality is they're all sort of tuned to essentially the cultural moment in which they're founded. And as you get more and more and more removed from that, it can become difficult to stay culturally relevant. And in fact, I visited an evangelical church here earlier this year, and I looked around the congregation. I said, you know what? This church, which is probably 30 to 40 something years old, not sure exactly when it was founded, has mainline disease. And I say, what's mainline disease? I can see that the congregation is skewing older. I can see that there are fewer, young people with kids there. The liturgy was a little boring. Like the music wasn't like the fight. And you could just see this is a church that was hot 20, 30 years ago, really spoke to that cultural moment, attracted a great congregation, many of whom are still there, still invested. They're preaching the gospel 100%. There's no theological drift. And yet you can see that this church is starting to show signs of the aging and demographics that you see there. And I would suspect this is very common among evangelical churches that have been around a while. They were planted in a suburban area that was the hot place. It was growing. The families were moving in. Well, now sprawl's moved on. The demographics of your area have changed. There's shiny new churches everywhere. They got the hip young guy who's the pastor. They got the music that's right there. And it could be very easy to miss a step stylistically and fall into a period of decline. And again, once you have a church that starts to have visible demographic issues, that in and of itself becomes a barrier to attraction. I mean, if you're a young person, or you're a family, and you walk into a church and you see a lot of old people, you're probably thinking, this is not the church for me, right? So those sorts of things start to become self-fulfilling prophecies, self-reinforcing challenges. And so I think this could easily happen to a large swath of evangelical churches. I mean, again, a lot of them were founded in the 70s and 80s. They're starting to get old. Demographics are changing. Not all of them can keep up. And, it's a problem. Something that Bill Hybels said really stuck with me several years ago. This was probably almost a decade ago now. I went to the Willow Creek Global Leadership Conference, which is a big, almost like a secular type leadership development program. It's religious for sure, but it's really oriented around helping you become a better leader. There's a bunch of nonprofit leaders, ministry leaders who were there, who were doing it. They have big name speakers there. Condoleezza Rice spoke the years I was there. I think Stephen Covey had spoken to some of these things in the past. They get like big name people, and it was really good. Bill Hybels spoke about the pending succession crisis. And this was, long before his own succession issues became a problem. He's like, I founded this church in the 70s. I'm going to retire within the next decade, we have a plan in place. In 1970, there were virtually no megachurches, or maybe 5 megachurches in the United States. Today, there are thousands of megachurches in the United States, many of them still run by their founding pastor, many of whom are approaching retirement age. How are you going to find successors that can lead a megachurch for all these places? This is going to be a huge issue. And so, again, what we've seen in some of these big flagship type churches, there has been choppy waters with successions around founding pastors. And so this is one that's going to be there. And so I'm not saying that evangelical churches are all going to go down the tubes. Don't want them to all go down the tubes. But this idea that a church can't get old and go into decline, that the problems that have plagued the mainline denominations could not equally as plague some of the evangelical churches, is one that I think is just, we need to reject that. We can't be smug and think all that matters is that we preach the gospel and then we're safe. Again, maybe good to preach the gospel. That's the most important thing. But there were a lot of places that used to preach the gospel and don't preach it anymore. Look at what happened to Israel. Every time there was a good king, there was a bad king. People have a tendency to get off track. Why are you not going to get off track? The fact that you're on track now is great. Why are you not going to get on track? And oh, by the way, there's a lot of other things that factor into these declines. And there's actually a vast body of research that's been done on mainline decline. The Lilly Endowment, which is a gigantic foundation based here in Indianapolis, they have a dedicated religion-giving program. And in the 1970s especially, but even beyond that, they've funded tons and tons and tons of scholarly research into what happened to the mainline. Of course, they weren't able to come up with any solutions necessarily, but there's a lot of thinking that's been done on this. And again, like a lot of this evangelical idea that what's going on out in the culture out there, we just reject the world, so we have to think about that too much. Well, eventually it's going to come knocking on your door. And eventually some of the problems that affected these mainline churches could very easily affect you as well. So I would suggest thinking seriously about this. Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And he was talking about Intel and all the changes that they had to make in order to keep their company from going under, from getting outflanked in the market. Intel had originally been a memory chip company, and memory chips were really core to their identity. They're like, wow, this is who we are. We make memory chips. Their memory chip business, the Japanese and foreign competition was eating their lunch. So Andy Grove, and I don't know if it was Gordon Moore, who was in there, when a couple executives are sitting in the office, and they had this conversation. They said, what would the successor do if the board fires us and a new CEO comes walking in this door? What's he going to do? And they said, well, he's going to get out of the memory chip business. And they said, well, why can't we do that? And that's what they did. Like, we're going to exit the memory chip business. They made the difficult decision they needed to make to adapt the company. And this idea is, if you're not constantly thinking about what's going wrong, or what could go wrong, then something's going to sneak up on you. And even if you do, something could sneak up on you. So I think smugness about thinking, oh, these things could never happen to us, is unwarranted. As the Bible says, let anyone who stands take heed lest he fall. So think about that. I'd encourage you to be taking this seriously. I'm not saying everybody should become a student of the main lines, but I think it's worth asking. Look what happened to them. Why is that not going to happen to us? I'll talk to you next week.